Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. This is the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society. And I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Thank you so much for joining the conversation. Extended producer responsibility. The idea that manufacturers of products and packaging should take responsibility for collecting and recycling the things they make is a hot topic in the sustainability and business worlds. But only one EPR law has passed so far in 2023, Washington State's SB 5144, which requires battery makers to be responsible for environmental management of their products. Our guest today was a key player in advocating for the bill. Scott Cassel is the founder and CEO of the Product Stewardship Institute, a nonprofit that advocates and consults to develop circular economy solutions and extended producer responsibility legislation. That's a mouthful. A typical concern promoted by companies about proposed extended producer responsibility laws is the cost to the consumer. However, history shows that, for example, bottle deposit systems improve collection rates substantially without costing people very much more money. States with bottle bills collect 65% of bottles, while those without collect only 24%. So we can see clearly that bottle bills can more than double collection rates. Columbia University research also shows that, and I quote, even if EPR compliance costs were to lead to a doubling of packaging costs throughout the value chain, the computed upper bound is approximately 0.69% of grocery spending. This estimate corresponds to a maximum increase in monthly grocery bills of $4 per household. Now imagine that. For $4 per household, we could enable a circular economy. The environmental benefits of EPR are clear, but it is the economic impact that's most impressive. As part of the economy shifts to managing and moving products back to manufacturers for recycling and reuse, the Bureau of Labor Statistics projects that materials moving jobs will grow by 6.5% by 2031, or by about 861,000 new jobs, and as many as 304,000 new repair, maintenance, and waste management jobs are also expected by 2031. The circular economy is full of opportunity and the potential to create a more equitable nation. Let's talk with a leader working to design the next better life. You can learn more about Scott and the Product Stewardship Institute at productstewardship.us. Product Stewardship is all one word, no space, no dash, productstewardship.us. Welcome to the show, Scott. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. Nice to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us. You started the Product Stewardship Institute. I guess you could describe this as in the Holocene of sustainability. What was the state of thinking about manufacturer responsibility back in 2000 when you started this, and how's it changed and evolved?
Yeah, well, it was definitely a very new concept back then because in 2000, and we didn't start the EPR movement. I was just online here with a couple of the luminaries, Thomas Lindquist and Reed Lifset, because we're going to bring them on for a little, talk about how this whole thing started for them. Thomas was the one that developed this concept, and that was like 1992. But when we started this, it kind of hit me in 1998 when I was at a NAMA conference, North American Hazardous Materials Management Association. I was the president, and Ron Dreger from British Columbia came to the conference, and he talked about all the EPR laws that they had in British Columbia. And for me, that was the first I heard of it, even though this was around for 6-7 years beforehand. But in the United States, no one really heard of the concept of producers taking responsibility for their waste. Now, when they talked about the polluter pays principle, they go, oh, I understand that.
Right.
And this kind of relates to it in some ways. But it was a very new concept back then. They knew the concept of product stewardship more than extended producer responsibility. So we had to first define those terms as an organization for the United States way back then.
How would you distinguish between the two, between stewardship and responsibility?
Yeah, we use the term product stewardship because it had a little friendlier tone to it for
Mhm.
all the different stakeholders, producers particularly. Canada was using the term product stewardship. So Canada and the US are using it somewhat similarly. Europe uses EPR.
Mhm.
In the US, we have defined product stewardship as either voluntary or mandatory. And one of the main mandatory elements is EPR. So
Mhm.
EPR mandated, voluntary is stewardship. It's sort of the broader concept. But in Europe, the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, that really helps spread the concept of EPR globally, they have a broader definition of EPR. It includes voluntary, includes taxes,
Mhm.
and some various fees and other things that we don't count here in the United States. So, but we're consistent in many other ways.
Making progress. Do packaging and product makers realize that in addition to the brand benefit or the environmental benefits, that there are a lot of brand benefits to just being responsible for the stuff that you make?
I think that citizens around the world are demanding that now. I don't
Mhm.
think they can not hear that, particularly with the plastics pollution. I think that you know, the plastics all over the world in the marine environment, particularly, has woken everyone up to this issue of how we're dealing with packaging, and being responsible for it. Now, citizens are certainly responsible for putting that in the right place, but a lot of that has to do with citizens not knowing what to do with it.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
where do you put your plastics? What do you do with the bags? It's not convenient for us to recycle them often, and they're demanding more sustainable packaging, more sustainable materials. So I think that they are getting that message. They're making their own voluntary commitments on post-consumer recycled content, recycling targets, zero landfill. So the rhetoric is definitely there. But the legislation has to follow it in order to really make it worthwhile, because you have to level the playing field, for these companies. Yeah.
Well, how would you describe the basic elements of an EPR, a successful EPR program? Obviously, the first step, the consumer has to put the material back into the system in order for it to start to move through it. But who's responsible for all the steps in between the consumer and the reuse of the material?
Yeah, great question. Well, we've come up with a method for developing legislation, policy legislation, that boils it down to 16 elements. And when I say we, it's the Product Stewardship Institute, but it's all the state and local
Mhm.
government members that we have. We have, state and local government members all over the country that are real experts on EPR and solid waste. And we work with the producers and the recyclers and environmental groups as well. So, we PSI has boiled it down to 16 elements. And so one would be, for example, it's called covered materials. So if you're
Mhm.
talking packaging, it's like, well, how do you define packaging? Is it just packaging? Is it paper products? Is it also single-use plastic products? So that would all be one box. And then there's
Right.
exemptions, for that as well, for small businesses and other, another would be covered entities. Where are those going to be picked up from? Is it the household? Is it small businesses? Is it the public spaces, schools, other institutions? So we go through all of these different elements, and they're all really important. I'd say some of the big ones are performance targets. We need to really hold the producers, who are largely responsible for this, financing and managing these systems, holding them to targets.
Should that target be legislated, or is that something that should be adjusted on an ongoing basis based on the scientific measurement of the process?
Yeah, you're putting your finger on like a big point of discussion, let's say,
Mhm.
in the legislation. Of course, the environmental groups want to have high targets, whether or not there's baseline data, because they want to kind of reach high. Others, and I'd say government officials are largely there, want to have some baseline data
Mhm.
for source reduction, targets, for reuse targets, and for recycling targets of various materials. So I think that there's a combination of both. It's either done in statute, or it could be done by regulation, or it could be done through the stewardship plan. It's basically the architecture of how the producers or their organization that they're all going to belong to, a producer responsibility organization called a PRO. They would submit a plan now through an advisory council that is multi-stakeholder that comments on it, but ultimately the state oversight agency has that responsibility to approve or refine the stewardship plan, and including those targets in it.
So what are a few examples of effective EPR laws that have been passed in the past 20 years that you might point to when you're having a discussion with a legislator or a company about the potential to put it in place now?
Yeah, another good question. Well, first we have to realize that our understanding of EPR in general, globally and in the United States, also always builds on itself. So we're always gaining more information. The first state that passes a bill on any product is the pioneer. And others that follow always look to that state and then see what they want to change based upon their own knowledge of EPR and the bills that they pass. But with that said, I would say a lot of good bills. There's 132 of these EPR bills that have now passed in 33 states on 16 products. And so back in 2000, that was, there was like, 6 states, one product, batteries, and that was it. So I'd say we've got really good laws on paint. There's a very good model that is now in 11 states, and if Illinois governor signs the bill that has passed the Senate and the House, which we fully expect, that'll be the 12th law. There's the first household hazardous waste law that is waiting to be signed by the governor in Vermont. Washington's battery EPR law is sort of the next generation. It's the next step, and we're working in New York on similar things. So we're looking at that contains now e-mobility devices, which are the bicycles, the scooters, hoverboards, and things like that. So each one, I'd say, builds on itself. And electronics and tech, and so forth. Packaging, we've got 4 different laws, and they're all, building on one another.
Well, let me ask about the Washington State bill, because it's the biggest bill passed this year so far. It requires battery makers to take responsibility for the recovery and recycling of that wide range of batteries that you just described. Tell us what was involved in getting that passed. What kind of give and take was going on behind the scenes?
Yeah, well, see, that's one I would leave up to our members, King County, Seattle, and the state of Washington that worked on that, but also Heather Trim from Zero Waste Washington played a very key leadership role in pulling that together and making those negotiations. But working with the battery industry as I have for 30 years, I can tell you that it's the Portable Rechargeable Battery Association. Those are rechargeables. That's really what this is about right now. Yeah. And then Call to Recycle is the main PRO, has been for a very long time, to recycle these batteries. And so they want to make sure that it can operate well. So for example, I'm sure that discussions around convenience standards was very big, because that's what we're having, in New York now, is if you're collecting the bicycle batteries. Well, if you're a store that is selling batteries, you think, well, it makes sense for them to take back these batteries, just like the other rechargeables, the smaller rechargeables that we have for other devices. But from their perspective, there's more training, there's more space needed, there's more packaging needed, there's different regulations to follow. So it's a longer, more in-depth process, and they want to weigh in as to, well, where those sites should be. The governments are concerned about having enough convenience for their residents for these bicycles. So that is a sense of the negotiations that I'm sure took place there.
Convenience is such a key idea, and it's one that a lot of people, when they talk about the circular economy, sort of assume that consumers are going to have to get by with less convenience. But in fact, we can build very engaging process that feels like a positive part of the customer experience. What are the political dynamics of EPR right now? Clearly in Washington, citizen involvement was very important to the passing of the bill, but is the value of the policy driving the debate, or is corporate money still in the driver's seat in large part?
Well, corporations don't want to be held to, legislative standards for the most part, unless you're a leading company. I think that if you're a company that really has sustainability at the core, and you've put money in already, maybe it's just a marketing thing right now. But once it is the future, and those good companies, those smart companies, are investing in reuse. They're investing in more sustainable packaging. They have a leg up, but the legislation, I don't know, raises the playing field, and so they can compete, because right now they have to rely on the consumers and the marketing advantage they have, but to meet the law is a whole nother thing. And once that raises up, they have a really good advantage over others. So getting out in front for these companies is important, but it's not to say that there aren't companies that are dragging, don't want to understand, or even those companies that just don't know. We're finding even in the 4 states that passed the packaging EPR laws in 22 and 21, they don't really know what's involved in these laws. So that's a challenge for the government officials right now.
Now, you recently partnered with an industry program or alliance for the first time, the Pack Green Coalition, which encourages the adoption of EPR for renewable paper packaging and alternatives to plastic. Does this represent a turning point in the industry, that now that PSI and a PRO or a PRO intending organization are collaborating for the first time?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that they're a PRO organization, but it was the basis from RandPack is a random packaging, basically a company that prides themselves on sustainability. That's like their foot forward, and they're one of those companies that has really they're supporting EPR. They want to see it go in that direction. They understand that they will do well in that environment. And we're looking to have other manufacturers, packaging manufacturers, as opposed to the brands. So this is a difference that, we're looking at those who are making the packaging where they're not using the plastic. So we're looking to use either paper, other materials that are more sustainable. It could be mushrooms, Ecovative is a company that makes packaging out of mushrooms. Cruise Foam makes packaging out of chitons. It's a sea creature. So these are innovative. It could be composting. So these are the type of companies that we're looking to attract to show that this is good for business as well.
This is really interesting. I need to take a quick commercial break. We're going to be right back. And we are back to continue the conversation about the evolution of extended producer responsibility with Scott Cassel, who's the founder and CEO of the Product Stewardship Institute. Scott, as we've been talking, you've referred to product responsibility organizations, and these are the entities created by EPR laws to manage and drive the success of the collection and recycling of materials. But these are typically oriented around materials and geographically focused. How can we start to think about evolving the legal structure of PRO so that they can merge and grow to build more robust collection capabilities? How do we create economies of scale by addressing multiple waste streams?
Yeah. Well, the PROs, producer responsibility organizations, do represent sort of products. So we're seeing packaging has right now one producer responsibility organization that was approved in Colorado as the first one. We'll see if, and they are going with just one for the first number of years before opening it up. Oregon has an opportunity for multiple ones. but they're by product areas. So you'll have packaging, which is, all the materials. It's glass, it's paper, it's, cardboard, plastics, all of that. You have paint. Paint Care is the PRO that has formed all those companies around them. They have thermostats as the TRC, the Thermostat Recycling Corporation, mattresses, the Mattress Recycling Council, and so forth. So the most of them are single ones. We've got 2 on pharmaceuticals, Med Project, and also Inmar. And so what we see is that there's a lot of PROs, and the question I think you might be asking is, well, how can they all work together? Perhaps?
Yeah, well, how do we create the dynamic innovation cross material and cross geography to really build this up?
Well, I think it's a very big question, and you're looking at efficiencies, and I think that's where it's going. I just want to say, while I'm thinking about it, it's also on the other side with government. Government is managing all of these projects, and they're starting to think about what are the efficiencies that they can gain, because this is a lot for governments, even though it's taking the financial and management responsibility from government to a large extent. They still have to oversee these programs and enforce against them. So they're looking at ways that maybe other organizations, regional or otherwise, can help them with the data management, making it more transparent, having it available to them as opposed to just the PROs. And so I think we're looking at it from both sides. From the companies, let's say in Circular Materials is one organization that it has good experience. That's in Canada. They're a PRO, and they're looking to work with multiple provinces in Canada. They've combined, for example, bottle drop-offs with maybe clothes drop-offs and other things. So I think there's ways to do this, and it does take big thinking. It first has to have the program itself stable, and then you can kind of reach out to the other programs and see how to gain efficiencies.
So let's dig into the roles the PRO plays a little bit. And I want to ask some specific questions, particularly around, like, for instance, infrastructure development. How can government and private firms better partner to fund and grow the collection infrastructure and the processing infrastructure we need? Where should we be thinking about concentrating their efforts?
Well, the concept of EPR is that there's funding from the producer. So, right now there isn't funding for any of these materials for government, whether it's household hazardous waste, paint, or packaging, and that's the recycling. It's all coming from government and the taxpayer, in some cases the ratepayers. So the funding is huge. You need that for infrastructure, and that's needed to maintain and sort of fortify the current infrastructure for packaging, and then to enhance it, and then gain efficiencies. Packaging, these systems have been there, we have to understand, for 40, 50 years in many cases, and it's built by the private sector, and sometimes the municipal governments themselves that have their own fleets of trucks and recycling facilities. So we have to fortify those systems, and make sure that there's a big question of, do we require the use of existing infrastructure, or is it prefer? Of course, this is those that have the infrastructure want it used and expanded, and investments in it. The producers want more leeway of their funding.
And in terms of operations, and we talked a little about this before, should the PRO do the hands-on work, or should it dole out that work through contracts and manage against the defined goals in the law or that have been updated by the state's regulatory leadership?
They will either reimburse municipalities for the municipal work, and municipalities, whether they have their own fleets, they get reimbursed. Whether they have contracts privately, they get reimbursed. The other way of doing it, which is in Colorado, which is they're taking because in Colorado, each household is on their own. We call that subscription service. So basically the PRO there will run the system, but they will hire out to private sector for the collection and for the processing. So they don't do the operations themselves. It's more of a management organization for the producers.
And finally, this is something we hear about at Earth 911 all the time from people who are confused by the contradictions they get in the various guidance delivered to them about how to recycle. What is your recommendation about the best way to surface and promote recycling, composting, and other how-to guidance to help people take that first step successfully?
Well, first we need to fix the problems, and some of the problems are, some of the states are working on this and have passed legislation on labeling. So the consumer is confused for multiple reasons. One is that sometimes the packaging they have says recyclable or compostable, and it may or may not be recyclable or compostable
based on where they are
in that municipality, in that state, what it is. So that's a first thing is setting, and that is a very big thing that I think the US EPA should help to coordinate, so there's not 50 different ways of doing it around the country. The other is these EPR systems have funding in them for education. And one of the things I haven't mentioned yet that's very important is a needs assessment. It's a concept that it's one of the first things that all these bills do. And some of the states are actually doing it even before legislation passes, like New York was doing a needs assessment. Now Maryland is doing, the legislature has mandated a needs assessment that a contractor to the state will do. And Illinois will follow similar suit. But that needs assessment is basically figuring out what's the gaps. And one of the main things is education. How can we fortify that and give the right messages to the consumer as to where they can recycle, making it convenient for them. So it all goes together, of course. And so you can't tell and expect a resident to recycle if it's inconvenient. And there are very, standards in these laws for how to make it convenient for them. It's got to be at least as easy as to throw out their trash, to recycle. And, and from there, it is a communication thing. And many companies do a good job. You look at paint care, for example, on the paint program. One of the things that's different about packaging than most of these other products we're talking about, the toxics, the difficult to manage, is that on packaging, those systems have been in place and we're now readjusting them. On paint and other things, they weren't there before.
Right.
So paint care, they were developed by the American Coatings Association, and our organization mediated that agreement with the paint industry back in 2002 to 2006 or 7 to develop that program. And paint care has great educational materials, videos, online, everything you really want to know. And it's, I think, a very good example of once the program's set up, once the program is working well, then you can really expect and prepare the residents for what you want them to do.
I want to widen the aperture a little bit and ask your perspective as the executive director of the Product Stewardship Institute about some of these highly trafficked ideas amongst brands about how to reduce their impact. So kind of a flash round here. Is lightweighting of packaging instead of adopting more recyclable materials a positive step, or is that kicking the can down the road?
I'll give you my favorite answer. It depends, right?
Well, give me an example of when it counts.
Well, it depends on the environmental impact. So this is where the life cycle assessments will come in. So you can lightweight and go to a material that damages the product, and of course that's not good. You can lightweight and it's to another material that has greater impact on the environment. That's not good. So ultimately, we want to have less environmental impact. I think that is really the basis. And we're seeing, I think more and more the concept of life cycle assessment in these EPR bills, and they're in the packaging bills themselves. We want reuse, we want source reduction, and even in the chemical recycling, with these facilities, which is, a big issue, whether or not it's plastics taken and processed into plastics or into fuels, which, the state doesn't like the fuels. They're on a maybe, let's hear about it on the plastics. But it ultimately has to, those technologies even legislatively have to be matched up against virgin plastic production and mechanical recycling. So this concept, of it depends, I think it's getting, it's less vague and it's becoming more clear what we mean by that. So that's my answer.
Well, and it allows us, by beginning to understand it and baseline it on a regional basis, the differences, and then we can start to harmonize the rules over the long term. How about this? The adoption of bio-based plastics, given the complexity of recycling that in combination with other plastics, how do we make that transition work, in your opinion?
Yeah, I like to call it compostable packaging. And so that's another area, which is a hot button issue that needs to be resolved. I just say these are problems. There's problems and then there's various solutions. Some we know, some we have to figure out. We need to figure this one out. We need to, there's many companies that have developed compostable packaging of different types. Again, it could be made of, I don't know, plastic derivatives or something. I mean, plastics to compost, I'm not sure, but other compostable packaging, we need to make sure it's not mixed in with the recycling stream.
Exactly.
Recycling, we want to have materials that last, that aren't going to crumble. Compostables, we want it to crumble. We want it to return into the earth. So we need to keep those streams separate. And the infrastructure for that needs to develop. The education for that needs to develop. And there's testing companies like the BPI, Biodegradable Plastics Institute, Products Institute. Thank you. So those are certifications that are going to be really important. So when we see them on the package, we will know, BPI certified. Okay, I can put this into the composting stream.
Do you see carbon offsets of manufacturing, shipping, or product footprints as part of the solution, or is that another form of kind of delaying real accountability for the impact of the product?
I've always seen it as a side issue. I myself don't take the carbon credits and pay extra for this. I don't think that's the answer. I think the answer is that we have to take responsibility for reducing impacts right there and then, and not like keep the impacts and somehow buy it on the other end and pay for it. I'm not a big fan of that.
And finally, there's a concept of materials traceability, and it's often described as a product passport, something that allows you to look at where everything came from and where everything is going. Is that, sometimes that sounds like overkill. Is it too much information?
Not in my mind. No, I think that's where things are going. It's going that way in Europe, and we study Europe for over 2 decades now and bring these concepts as best we can, best practices to the United States. We see this in batteries directive. We see it in the packaging directive. We should want to know where those materials go. If they're domestic, are they responsible end markets? And this is where the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality has, I think, the first time put that into their packaging EPR law. And they're now working to define that some more. But what it means is like the place where we're sending these materials, either domestically or overseas, are up to snuff for environmentally, for worker safety, other standards. And we need to be doing that more. And these, these tools that you mentioned of the passport, could be a possibility. I don't know specifically how that would work and so forth, but I like the concept that we can trace it. We need to trace data and to have that accessible and transparent. And I think that will really, go a very long way to bringing us to sustainability.
Now, EPR adoption has been on a nice linear adoption curve. What do we need to do to take it to the next level and really ramp up EPR legislation across the country? And what is your advice to a consumer who wants to see a change?
Well, consumers, starting there, they can always work from the ground up. The grassroots organizations and citizens do have a voice, and you can amplify it by being part of an organization that is advocating for EPR laws. Whether it's your state environmental organization, or whether it's a local chapter of the Sierra Club, or other organizations that are out there. So that's one way to do it, and that's frankly how I started. Way back when, is volunteering and doing all that work. The other is for the US EPA, I think, to get more involved in this. There's a question, I believe, in many of their minds, is whether or not they're authorized by RCRA, how far they can go, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, how far they can go, but they can give guidance. They can show what's available. If a state wants to go in this direction, what would they recommend? They certainly can help on the labeling, and some goals, as you were talking about, setting goals to help set some baselines, giving states some guidance how to set their own baselines. States right now, I know they're doing waste characterization studies from these big grants that are coming out. I'd like to see it move from there, and have those grants be used more to help and assist for those states that want to move on extended producer responsibility. I think the other is, the associations are starting to come around. The companies here, the producers, they join in associations, and I mean, I've seen it explode really with the packaging, because of the lack of markets from what we call the China sword policy, and so that it really woke up the politicians, because it hits the pocket, the money pocket, and that's a big one. So I think that we're in a very good place. We have lots of laws, lots of experience, and I see it exploding even globally. Even in emerging markets, they're all passing EPR laws.
We're seeing the same thing, particularly about how National Sword has affected the evolution of the infrastructure here in the States. Now, your site has a lot of great resources for getting involved in understanding this, particularly the EPR legislation tracker, a map that lets you just browse all your states. How can folks follow your work and support PSI?
Well, one is through productstewardship.us. To go onto the website there, we have a newsletter that everyone can sign on to. That's there as well. We have memberships for state and local governments by population. We have a lot of the states that are members already. That gives us the funding to do our work. We have partnership as well, partnerships that are similar to the memberships, but for all non-governments. So that would be for producers, for recyclers, for environmental groups, for academic institutions, and international governments. And we have over 120 of those. And so it really helps us there. We also do consulting for public and private. We get half our money from public, state and local governments, half from private. And then we get some even unsolicited donations to us, which is a real nice wake-up call for us, that there's people out there that recognize and contribute to our organization. So we'll always take the donations, and all of that is on our website.
Well, Scott, thank you very much for spending time with us today. We appreciate it.
Yeah, Mitch, it's been a real pleasure. You've asked some wonderful questions. Thank you.
We've been speaking with Scott Cassel. He's the founder and CEO of the Product Stewardship Institute. They work to develop extended producer responsibility laws and best practices across the nation. And you can find out more about them at productstewardship.us. Product stewardship's all one word, no space, no dash. The collection and processing of materials is a local problem that must be solved with a global context, because materials may flow all the way around the world during each product lifecycle. The early producer responsibility organizations that we discussed in batteries, paint, plastic, and electronics, for example, are pioneering a circular economy. And we're just starting to erect the infrastructure that will enable a continuing circular flow of materials. New technologies are lined up on the runway and ready to take off to accelerate the progress that we're making with advanced recycling technologies, materials tracking technologies, and new consumer education capabilities that will turn the work of reuse into a convenience and an experience of responsible customer participation in keeping stuff moving through the economy. We can and should be asking companies and governments to work together through EPR legislation to make it easy and personally rewarding to participate in that circular economy. Scott has a new book about EPR coming out later this year, and we'll have him back on to talk about in detail more of the steps that we can all take. Would you take a moment to share this podcast or any of the more than 400 that we produced on sustainability in your ear? If you'd take a moment to write a review on your favorite podcast platform, it will help your neighbors find us. Folks, you're the amplifiers that help us spread more ideas to create less waste. So please tell your friends, family, and coworkers they can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or any of the other fine purveyors of podcast goodness they might prefer. Thank you so much, folks, for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Earth911, and we will be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.